So excited to be here and also excited that everyone has eaten and is satiated, and it's the best time, I think, to talk. But seriously, really excited to learn so much from other product marketers here. I don't know if I see Gary, but it was the most, I was looking for a reason to do improv, so I was particularly excited about that one. So I'm here today to talk about designing a regenerative product marketing org. I oversee the product marketing department at Vacasa. Vacasa is North America's largest vacation rental management company. So that means if you have a second home and you want to make money off of it as a short-term rental, you just give us your keys and we'll do everything from housekeeping, marketing, guest service, and we have a lot of technology to support that. And so I thought that I would start today, if we want to go to Slido, have a question to engage and start to get into the topic a bit. So the question here is, which of the following for you do you think is the biggest blocker to success internally? So there's things like misalignment on strategy, lack of consistent process, lack of trust from stakeholders, not enough time to do things right, and there's one other one, I missed it. Awesome. This is so interesting to see. I love this. Oh yeah, non-feedback loops was the last one. Cool, so it looks like lack of consistent process coming out on top. And, but you know, everything's about 20, 30, some of these are pretty all important. And if we want to go now to the next slide, you'll be glad to know we stacked the deck, and we actually are going to be talking about all of them a little bit, because these have all been on my mind, because when I started at Vacasa, there was not a product marketing function. And so I wanted to understand, like, how do you start this thing that people don't even know what product marketing is? How do you not expend a ton of energy, wasting time, trying to educate stakeholders, trying to reinvent the wheel every time you have to do go-to-market? And so my background, as mentioned, is as an ethnographer, and so I think a lot about how can we take complex systems and design them into something simpler by observing the ecosystem. So I came into Vacasa and I understood who are all the stakeholders, what does the org look like, and how do we then create process in that system? And nowhere designs for efficiency better than nature. Nature has underground networks of fungi that talk to each other, complex color networks. A leaf is more efficient at taking in solar energy than a solar battery right now. And so nature really knows how to design for efficiency. So that's where I looked first. And I thought about how does it take an entire system and have it work together? And how can I then apply that in a similar way? Now, there's many natural systems. So you may have heard of biomimicry. You may have heard of the sophisticated knowledge of TEK or traditional ecological knowledge. But one that I've actually been really invested in recently is permaculture or permanent agriculture. And this is because I was designing a rainwater harvesting system at home. So Seattle gets a ton of rainwater, and I wanted to think, how do I make use of that? Not just always getting the water that's coming out of the tap, but actually putting a bucket underneath the top of my house where the rain comes through, and then I can use that to water the plants, making use of what's available and having a more efficient system. And so that's just my first way of dipping my toe in, been trying some other things. But I really got into permanent agriculture, or permaculture, and realized there's a ton to learn from it. So a little bit of background here. What is permaculture? How did it arrive? Why is she talking about it? Permaculture arose because of our industrialized, consolidated agricultural system. So it's a very energy-intensive system. We use things like machinery and a lot of different systems that have driven a ton of yield in the last century, more than we've seen before. Short term and a lot of profit. But at the same time, we're seeing that it's leading to things like depleted land, resources, and soil. I'm from California, and so I see this a lot, just driving down the 5 in terms of, lack of water, what's happening with our pollinators because of monocrop cultures. We're getting a ton of yield and expending a ton of energy to get there, but at the end of the day, it also means it's a less efficient system that's not for the long term. So again, why is she talking about this? Because permaculture is a design-intensive system. It takes that idea of energy intensive, flips it on its head and says we can design closed loop systems. We can design systems that are self-supporting by requiring minimal human input. And it allows us to lead transformative thinking into doing. And now it's not just about agriculture, so that's the interesting thing. It's also how do we take, for example, heating and cooling our home and design more efficient systems by taking use of simple things like solar energy, creating rocket stoves, designing community spaces in such a way that people can get from one place to another very efficiently. And so I thought if it's applied to all of these things besides agriculture, then why not org design? Why not design a more efficient org this way? So in particular, I'm sure many of us have felt this way, but product marketing is a really ambiguous space. And it can lead to us feeling, at least for me, very depleted. It can lead to us trying to have to say, are we over-explaining ourselves? And then in the terms of the type of marketing, there's marketing where you have to do paid advertisements, and you might have to strong arm and rely on that sort of performance. But what I love about product marketing is about finding natural synergies between the customer and the business, and then even internally. Rather than saying we're just going to put a ton of billboards out there and put our name everywhere so everyone thinks about us constantly and then buys our stuff, it's about saying, as we were talking about value props earlier today, how do we understand the customer needs and then talk to those needs and more efficiently have a synergy between the two? Internally, marketers as a group is one of the highest burnout rates. And so that's just another reason that efficiency is so important in our design, because we're constantly running around, moving from changing strategy, point A to point B. And one of the most common complaints among product marketers is the idea of misalignment. So how do we solve for these issues? How do we not have a high burnout on our team? And how do we solve the issues of misalignment? So in terms of designing an org, expending less energy and making sure that we can get more out of it, I look to the 12 permaculture principles. So it's just a framework, but I'm going to lead you through what the 12 ones are. And then would love to hear afterwards if any of these kind of apply to your org as well. So the first one here is observe and interact. And this is the idea that before you do anything, say you're building your garden, you should look around. What does the system look like? How is the hill? Is the soil a certain condition before you do anything? So what that meant to me is we need to know our customer and our context before we go out there and start building anything. And so one of the first things that I did for the department was laying out a slide of showing every single stakeholder of this is the process of any sort of go-to-market, and the very first thing is always research. And just doing that education piece of we need to understand our context before we build anything. It's very easy to get in that fast-paced, solution-oriented context, and so let's build something by observing and interacting. The second one here is catch and store energy. And so I go back to the idea of my rainwater catchment system. It's about catching what is already available and valuable and fleeting and being able to use it in another context. And so when I think about, well, how does that apply to product marketing and to organizations, I think about all the available and valuable knowledge that gets lost, for example, in a meeting. And then you have to have another meeting because somebody didn't make it. And then you have to follow up with an email because somebody forgot or you needed to remind people what happened in the meeting. And so document everything is one of the biggest things that we try to instill at our company and within our org, of making sure that if you have that knowledge of what we already discussed in one place, you can reference people without having to continually be the point person and having that lived on. So nothing is lost. Number 3, obtain a yield. So this is an interesting one because I like to see all the different gardens and parks around Seattle, and yet so many of them have only ornamental plants, and I love beautiful ornamental plants, but it is funny when then you have to go to a grocery store to get food when there's all this viable land. And so how do we obtain a yield from spaces that potentially could obtain a yield from? And so I want to make sure when we're making marketing materials, it's not just ornamental materials, it's not just things that look beautiful, but it's things that really drive results. And so at the outset, it's about working really closely with the product teams to make sure that our KPIs are aligned and that it's not just a KPI around marketing, but that it ultimately ties to our same North Star at the end of the day. Number 4, apply self-regulation and feedback. So one thing in permaculture that I've been applying to my own garden has been testing and learning and experimenting and having those check-in points to say, how are things doing right now and how can I optimize for them to be better? In a previous life before this, I was a product manager. And so the agile framework was, I lived and ate and breathed all of that. So I brought those same ceremonies. Let's have retrospectives after every single one of our go-to-markets. Let's have stand-ups. Let's work within the sprint cycle and be able to have that continuous feedback loop to make sure that we're doing better all the time. Number 5, use and value renewables. So I have a group of friends that we like to do off-grid camping. And we build shade structures, we have meal prep that's extensive. Most recently have been designing a solar battery system so that we can take our tents, put a swamp cooler in them, and we can camp out in the desert and it's still very cool. It was actually a pretty high capital investment. It took a lot of work up front, but now we have that. We can go to the desert anytime and camp and be cool. And so what I really like about that idea is you can reap the benefits by building something just once. So I'm a huge fan of templates. Templates for product marketing briefs, templates for our project scope docs, for our timelines, campaign trackers, and using those over and over again so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And it also means that your stakeholders are very familiar with the same templates and how to use them and who should engage on them in what way. Number 6. Produce no waste. And so produce no waste is about how do we turn one thing into another. So compost, for example, is a way of turning one thing, the food that we didn't eat, and turning into valuable soil, and a really big part of permaculture, that sort of thinking. In terms of how do we turn one thing from another as an org, it's about efficient and internal stakeholder management. So how do we identify all the different stakeholders and what they do at the outset for different points of a launch? Who is going to be able to approve the different pieces of content? At what point do we need to bring in the VP of Ops to sign off before we actually do something with our field teams? At what point do we need to bring in sales and who on sales? So I'm a big fan of RACI. I'm sure there's lots of other ones that you guys may use in terms of identifying the stakeholders and what they do. But this is one of my favorites. Designing from patterns to details. So this is the idea that we have to look at how the pattern of a system is before we build for it. For example, what is the sun in terms of your backyard and where does it hit? Because that's going to tell you where you need to build your plants. It's going to tell you which one should be put where. We need to look at the big picture before we start getting into the details. In terms of how I applied that to the product marketing org, it's about understanding what is the strategy, because so often we get those really quick asks of, hey, I need a new one-sheeter for sales. Hey, I need a new positioning statement. I need it yesterday. And if we aren't all aligned on who our customer is and who the competitors are in a certain space, then we're going to be spinning our wheels. So it's doing that work up front and making sure everyone has signed off on the product marketing brief. Take a quick drink. Integrate, don't segregate. So this one is really about thinking of how can we find connections and support between things. So companion plants, anyone who is a gardening nerd like me, knows that certain plants, when you put them together, actually help each other because they take different things from the soil, and then the soil can actually support both of them better. And so this to me is about the power of packaging things. I'm not sure for everyone else, but our products can often be segmented in terms of what the internal team sees as a product. This is a code system that works in one way, and this is a code system somewhere else, so they're different products. But that's not the case for the customer often. For the customer, it's about how they come together, and it's about making sure that we bring feature sets together in a way that makes sense, that we bring products together in a way that we can sell them as a larger service. And so it's one of the things that our group is always focused on, is being that voice for what are the things that matter most for the customer and packaging that as the larger product, not just kind of what a individual product team might be. Using small, slow solutions. I'll just say that one extra slowly. So this is really about not trying to do too much, not trying to bite off too much at any one time. So it's really easy, for example, to have a go-to-market, have an end date, and just sort of march all the way towards there. But how do we set up those different gating points? So for example, having pilot programs, making sure that we have different opportunities for beta launches, and then also having different ways of chunking out the go-to-market process. So one of my favorite ones is using things like dead links to see if people are interested, a little bit more of a UX trick, but I still find it as a good way to understand engagement and which message someone might resonate with. And then another one is being able to have, where people sign up for a product before we actually have it released. And that gives us a way to then get engagement from those customers, see what they're most interested in, and then create the content around that. So trying to create a whole sort of beta approach to the rollout. Number 10, use and value diversity. Diverse systems are less vulnerable. They just are. And so this applies in lots of different ways. I mean, it applies obviously into the agricultural system, but in terms of an org, it means don't hire people that necessarily are just like you. Don't hire people that think like you. How do we challenge ourselves? But also, how do we challenge ourselves by bringing in diverse viewpoints? I think it's really easy if someone kind of disagrees with our messaging, they disagree with the way we might be trying to position something, to try to educate and push how we want it to be. But I found it really valuable to bring those same people into the conversation and challenge ourselves, because they probably have a really good viewpoint. And one of the best experiences I've had is actually bringing engineers into the discussions around messaging, because they have a really great understanding of what the product functionally does in a way that maybe I don't. I have the customer expertise, but it's the synergy of where those two come together, the diversity that really drives it forward. Number 11, the permaculture principle of use edges and value the marginal. There's magic that happens at the edges. And so the edges is, I was in New Mexico recently, and it's where the Rio Grande River meets the Albuquerque, New Mexico desert. And right at that edge are trees and greenery and just a beautiful magic from the two areas, so seemingly different, the water and the desert coming together, and it's making use of those edges. And so in terms of applying that, it's really about how do we do that same magic by bringing together two very different things. And so I like to bring in, when we ideate on launch strategies, it's about bringing in folks who aren't just within our department. Having designers, for example, comment on things like pricing, even though that's something we typically work with FP&A on, and having a lot of different perspectives in that way. It's very similar to the last one, they tie together a bit. But specifically around the launch strategy and having more of those ideation sessions as a group. And then the last one, number 12, is about creatively using and responding to change. Now, the world is dynamic, and I think as marketers, we all know that we have our pulse on everything from social, what's happening in the news, what's the latest trend, what's the coolest advertisement out there. And we also have our pulse on the competitors, on what's the technological landscape and how is that changing. So we need to be the ones that are always kind of embracing and standing and advocating for that. And we do this thing where we'll have once a month, whenever we get new research, and having a roadshow with that sort of research in the internal system, because we want to generate those conversations, even if it's among people we may think, it's not related to any one particular product or one particular launch. It's just about saying, hey, here's what's happening that's new, and being the people who stand for that. And moreover, it's also about making sure that we have that feedback loop. So making sure that the executive team also is giving input, analytics, any different way of providing feedback, bringing that in and being able to respond to that change. Now, at the end of the day, this is just a design system. There's many design systems. You could probably pick any framework that you like to approach how you design an org. But for me, what I really liked about it is, yes, a regenerative organization is about creating something that's more efficient, but also equitable. It's about thinking about how do we have self-sustaining customer interest, customers that truly become fans of what we do. How do we make sure that the people within our organization feel valued, not just our department, but our stakeholders, that they truly feel valued by what we do? So many great things that I've heard the last 2 days about making sure that stakeholders have little wins. And so I know that this is something that's on everyone's mind. And then also making sure that we're just efficient with our materials and our resources, because we're all very strapped on time. We can be very strapped in terms of the content that we can create at any one time. So let's be efficient with it. And in the words of permaculture, it's the principles of earth care, people care, and fair share. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you may have gotten something out of this, and at most maybe you get to the idea of permaculture. We can geek out on gardening together afterwards. So. Question. How can you expand on your documenting practices, what to avoid, and tips for success on this? Yes, I agree. I really am not a huge fan of having things across multiple. So I think what's interesting, what's interesting here on this question about documenting is separating out our communication platforms from the documentation itself. And so whatever method you choose, some people might say Confluence is our knowledge system. We actually have a lot of our knowledge in a larger Google Drive, and it's all organized of it's within a Google Doc, and it's within a certain format. And so it's all about, you can send it over Slack and email, but it's just making sure that it's in one place. And the other thing I would say is that it's always repeated. So for example, what we'll do is after a meeting, someone will take notes of the meeting, the outcomes of that. That will be the stored doc within the document system. It's the same thing that will get sent out on email. It's not any different. And so it's always making sure that there's consistency across what is sent in any one place. Because the worst thing that can happen, and this has happened to me, we're always still learning, is you end up creating multiple of something for a different use case. Like one of the biggest learnings for me was I tried to create a shorter brief of my product marketing brief for a different use case because the stakeholders were smaller, and that created so much confusion. So at the end of the day, it's just creating one document, and then if you have to have this section is for the creative team and this section is for the product team, it's in one place and it's centralized. What do you mean by dead links? So that is an approach in UX where you can have, if you don't actually build out a feature, you don't have the ability to click on it. It says something like coming soon, but then you can track that people are interested in that feature. So it's a little bit more of a UX hack, but it can also be used to determine interest in marketing. So for example, if there's 3 different types of blog posts, and it says, the different, they each align to a different persona, then you could essentially have it where you see if someone clicks on it, and then you could say something to the effect of more content coming soon. It's not the best experience for a user, but if you do it on a very small scale for a short time, now you have more information to know, is this something we should invest in content-wise? What is one thing you wish you could go back in time and tell yourself when you started? Oh my gosh. So many things. I think it's just about to be adaptable and flexible. I'm very process driven, as you can tell by me trying to put frameworks on everything. And I think that if you're too rigid, it can create just stress for yourself and for others. And so I think the one thing to know is half of our job is the marketing side and the working with product side, but a lot of it is really about just being able to work with a cross-functional environment, and that's dynamic. It's always dynamic. So I think just be flexible and just be more adaptable. What are tips for structuring a marketing/PMM team? It's an interesting one, yeah. So I don't oversee all of marketing. We have a larger marketing function, and so part of probably how we built product marketing has to do with overall marketing, but how we've done it is based off of customer set, so that we have multiple customers because we're a two-sided marketplace, and then we also have prospects that we treat very differently from acquired customers, because those acquired customers have upsell opportunities. So each PM will have a different focus area around the customer. I think future state, also building out to someone who's really more focused just on the insights piece, because that can be a job that's fully onto itself. And also maybe eventually having someone that is really focused just on go-to-market. That's probably when we get larger. But it's also about looking at people's skill sets and what do people like to do, and helping to design an org around maximizing what people are really good at. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time.